Digital agriculture is all the rage these days. I came back here, and the first thing the chief scientist who hired me asked me is, what is it? You know, what does it mean? And in actual fact, there is a lot of hype around, but there's also a lot of potential. So I hope I can clarify the bigger picture, clarify the potential, and possibly give some concrete ways forward. So what I want to talk about is this, basically what digital agriculture actually means and how to make it work for you as individual farmers and also as a grower group. Point. There. So what I'll talk about today, 20-25 minutes, if that's okay. I'll talk about what they call digital transformation. There is a lot of hype around, but there's also a reality behind that that could be extremely important. I want to talk a bit about on-farm experimentation because that's something we kind of stumbled into in the 90s, again here in WA, and we're picking up again as a very powerful way to actually start using the power of data from precision agriculture. And I'll just end up by talking about the importance of organising to actually create and share value from the technology, because if you can't create value from the technology, it just won't happen. Growers won't pick it up. And if you can't share the value amongst yourselves within the grower group or between grower groups, then the change won't be sustained. So, digital transformation, big data, you hear these terms. The first thing that you see is a massive expansion of ag tech. We started off with precision ag, but it's not just precision ag. There's a whole range of new technologies that have come in now in both grains and animal production. There is a whole range of scientific disciplines that are new, and right down to the bottom right, there is massive computing power that just wasn't available to us in the 90s. Now all of this has kind of been entered into agriculture. Some of it is entered in almost by accident, actually, and I'll explain that in just a second. But what we have a massive range of technology waiting to be used. Now, it needs to be used. This is a figure from the McKinsey Corporation, which is like a scoreboard of the penetration of digital technologies into different sectors. Now this is for the global economy, but there's also one produced for the Australian economy that has the same story, which is that agriculture is kind of bottom of the class, okay? For various reasons, agriculture has the lowest level at the moment of adoption of digital technologies. Now that is also a huge opportunity, and it's being seen as a big opportunity. And if you can see on the right-hand side, there is a massive influx of investment in ag tech. Been increasing more or less every year. Had a bit of a dip last year, but in 2016, in 2017, picked up again to over $10 billion. That's US dollars, over $10 billion in 2017. So a lot of money coming in. Now, partially that's because there's money actually looking for a home. People are looking for investments, but the other thing is that agriculture is seen as something that's really ripe for investment in new technologies. And there are all sorts of people who are investing in this. As Chloe mentioned, I'm also in one of these CRCs, the Food Agility CRC, and the first thing that struck me in that is that the partners in the Food Agility CRC include people like NAB, KPMG, IAG, so you've got financial institutions who before we'd have been chasing after and trying to get them involved in research, had no interest at all. Nowadays, they're kind of knocking on the door, trying to find out what they can do with this. So things have definitely changed. You're definitely in the right industry. Now, it's not just precision agriculture. And in actual fact, most of the money coming into ag tech is actually going on the market side of things. What's called here downstream. If you look at the scale of investment, there, $5.9 billion actually in the downstream side of things. It's growing quite a lot. A bit more than is growing in the upstream. The upstream is about production, about producing stuff. So things have changed dramatically, and some of these deals are extremely large. There is a huge amount of activity in sales and mergers in that, and there are already people exiting out of this. This is good news and bad news, because what it can mean is that you've got money for startups, money for new enterprises coming in, but also it can mean that there are some big fish in there that are actually gobbling up potential competitors. So, you know, I don't know what you think about John Deere, whether you think it's good that they're actually busy acquiring companies to make their footprint even broader within the system. I'm not too sure myself. I think there's good news and bad news, so it's something we've got to watch out about. The one thing interesting is that there's quite a lot of increase in what's called midstream organising, which is between farm gate and the market, actually determining how you manage data and how you manage the technology within that. There's also a continuing interest in ag biotech, and I think what that reflects is that ag biotech, it's very easy to capture IP, and we'll come back to this. If you can capture IP quickly, you can generate value and you can continue attracting investment. This investment goes into production, but it goes into other areas as well, and that's quite an important thing to consider. As I said, if you think of each of these arrows as a value chain, in WA, grains is still the big one. In Australia, it's not the biggest, but in WA, it's by far the biggest one. And we've tended to focus a lot on producing more and better grain. But in actual fact, if you look at digital agriculture in a broader sense, you'll find most of the activities are actually matching production to market, reading market signals and responding to those. Very important. So you can see the thing is starting to switch around, that we're not moving out of a phase of just producing more and then finding buyers to actually responding to emerging market signals. And the news that we get from AGIC and others is that market signals are going to be increasingly difficult. So the question is how quick can we move the production system to actually keep producing what the market wants? There are other areas in this digital agriculture. One is about strategy, and that's why the NABs of this world are interesting. They're looking to see how they can invest in agriculture and how they can invest in farmers, but also intermediaries. And there's also the point here about developing resource. And by that, I mean the land resource. And we have projects that are developing about valuation of land and soil resources, what the technology can do for that, but also how can you develop HR, how can you develop the human resource. A lot of worry these days about Mora College being closed, and I think that's actually quite a worrying sign, because what we must have actually out in the wheat belt, technically competent middle-sized operators to actually support individual growers. That is the thing that worries me a little bit. So just have a look at this. The top, this is each of these bars these are 2015 figures, but the 2017 aren't so different in relation to one another. A lot of the activity that you see in digital agriculture, if you search the web for that, you'll find it's all about fancy, small volume value chains, about the fancy tomatoes, all about vertical agriculture, or things like this. Very sexy, very photogenic. You know, you see that, it looks very, very good. Robots, even drones to a degree. All of those are about high value, but very small volume. The point about us in WA, we have to look at these big ones, and the biggest one of all is broadacre cropping, still. It's still going to be. It's still highly profitable at the top end, over 10% per annum, and so this can attract, and we can argue that we can continue to attract funds to increase the efficiency of this. Now, there are still big efficiency gains to be had. So whilst these small volume value chains, quite attractive to some researchers, and we are working with these about developing market value, there's still a lot to be done increasing production efficiencies. And that's still a valid goal to have in digital ag. As Chloe mentioned, food agility, CRC, something I'm involved in. And the point about this is that all of a sudden things are changing to expand research, not from just production, producing the right thing, or building the future workforce or system, is also about getting the marketing right of the system. Okay, so that's the important take home for there, is an increasing interest in the market and marketing systems. Okay. Now, all very good. That's kind of a big picture thing. You can summarize that by saying there's a shift towards the market. There's a lot of money coming into agriculture and a lot of new players that weren't around before. But the question is, how can you actually use it? How can you actually get this technology to work for you? And so what I want to talk about is on-farm experimentation. It's not everything in digital agriculture, but it's a practical place to start. And the reason we need to start somewhere is this, is that there is disillusionment already amongst some growers that they feel that they've been sold again a technology that isn't creating value for them. And this is something from the Wall Street Journal from last year, and they're talking about everybody is still trying to figure out where the value in data is. People have heard about big data, they can see that it's generally a good thing, but if you read the comments on the left-hand side, there's some disappointment from people who have adopted it and haven't been able to make money out of it. In actual fact, if you look at adoption, it's a bit patchy. I think 100% of headers that were sold after 2012 have the capacity to monitor and map yield. I think less than 50% are even switched on. And this green line, only about 20–25%, this is in Australia, are actually used in seriousness to collect the data and actually do something with it. The picture is the same. This is from Argentina. Similar kind of system. There are some technologies like auto steer that are easy to adopt. There are other data-rich technologies that require management that are more difficult to actually get money out of. So that's something that we need to work on. So the question is, if you want to get some value out of data or out of data recording system, then here's one option. Why not experiment? This is a simple experiment that was done with one-for actually. So this is actually summer cropping, but it could be anything. The farmer just wanted to try something out, so he put some strips in, try a few runs of this, change, try a few runs of the other thing, keep going that. Now the important point about this, two important points about this, is one, it's big, so he was able to use conventional machinery, didn't get in the way. The other is that it didn't get in the way and he was able to do it easily. The other is that what you see here, and I just did a quick analysis on this, is that you'd see some effects of strip by strip comparison. But where the big information is actually within each strip. In other words, within each strip, you go from good to bad. Virtually all big experiments have this. In actual fact, we find that 90% of the variation in these big experiments is actually within the treatment, not between the treatments. In other words, the landscape itself is actually dominating the variation. And so that's what growers see. That's what they see every year. So why not fit the experiment to the size at which they understand the system? It's not that difficult to do. The system is basically this. You consider it as an input-output system. Okay, what do growers spend per hectare every year on fertilizer? What, about 350,000, something like that? That's an input, 350,000. You want to know what you get out of it. How many actually know what they get from that investment and how much it varies? The experiment is just a system that takes out the noise in that analysis so that you can see the input-output relationship. It's as simple as that. We actually stole the idea from Japanese manufacturing, who used it to improve their production of manufactured goods. It changes the inputs. The idea is that you just change inputs in a known way. Strips, multiple strips, waves, whatever it is, blocks, whatever it is you want to do. If you've got a yield monitor, it's easy to measure what happens, and then you just got to work out what it means. That's the tricky bit, is doing the analysis, and then use that insight to support decisions. And it's not a one-off process, it's a continuous changing process. And the experience is that growers experiment, all growers experiment anyway, and once they experiment, they keep experimenting. They like to keep experimenting. So what design options do you have? Well, you can have strips if you want. You can replicate them if you want, but it's not absolutely essential. How many levels would you have? 2 or more. You can have two-way strips if you want to do it that way. Or if you have VRT and you want to use it, you can develop all kinds of VRT designs. It doesn't have to be as fancy as this. This was actually designed that we put out in the 90s. The beauty of it is that it covers the whole paddock. It was invisible to the grower at the time of installation, and it provides a good picture of the entire paddock. And you might want to do long-term monitoring. So if you're talking about soil amelioration, obviously that's something that you'd monitor not just over 1 or 2 years, but you'd want to keep on monitoring that. There are 5 general rules that we're adopting. The first one is this, is keep it farmer-centric. In other words, it goes around a discussion, a dialogue between the consultant or the agronomist or the advisor and the farmer about what they're interested, what the farmer is interested in experimenting with, because this is about improving management decisions. We would say keep it simple, keep it as simple as possible. You'll still get a lot of information out of very simple experiments. I think keeping it big is something that is quite important because you want to use conventional farm machinery, and also you don't want to get in the way of the grower at critical times. During seeding or harvest, you've basically got to allow growers who experiment to proceed as they would proceed anyway, and then pick up the data later and analyze it later. And the other thing is, it's about a continuous exploration. One experiment will throw out some useful information, but it's really about a process of improving management over time. What do the results look like? Well, often you see that the overall treatment effect isn't all that spectacular. You know, we hear about flat response curves to nitrogen, for example. They only look like that because you get massive variation within the paddock or within the space. In actual fact, the local effects are often huge. So if you experiment at paddock scale, you'll see a lot of variation in that. And you'll also see a lot of treatment effects, factors operating together, which of course is a reality, but from a traditional experimentalist approach, that's a complication. But I would say just go for it anyway, and use that to grow knowledge incrementally. So on the right-hand side, you just have an image. In actual fact, this is oil palm. In oil palm, they apply up to 1,000 kg of fertilizer or nutrient per hectare every year. And even they don't really know what it does. On the basis of this experiment, which cost them nothing, they changed their fertilizer practice immediately because they could see, and this is an experiment actually over 6,000 hectares. So, you know, the big picture really helped them, and it showed them over a substantial area, the reddish areas, they just weren't getting any kind of response. And in actual fact, all of the response and all of the revenue from that 1,000 kilograms of nutrient per hectare was actually being generated from about 2/3 of the area. And we repeated this over time so that they got a very good grip on the system, and they were able to change their fertilizer management almost instantly and almost for free. The key to this is about interpretation. So there are some questions that growers or consultants or advisors are likely to ask. First is, what's the overall effect? As I said, that might be relatively moderate. The second question is the key one, is how does the effect vary? And then the third one, how much do you know about the variation? Do you know why you got the variation? You're going to have some answers, but not all answers. And so if you know all those, what does this tell you about the efficiency of resource use? In other words, what proportion of your land actually responds to fertilizer? What proportion is responding to lime or gypsum or whatever it is that you're investing quite heavily in? How much do you know about where the revenue is actually being generated from and which areas are just not paying for themselves? And then the question is, how can you use that information to actually increase management skill? Because the long game of this is actually increasing management skill of all the things that growers have to manage. And that is, as I say, the core of enduring profitability, is actually in the management skill. New battery. Do we need a new battery? There we go. So the third bit is the tricky bit, is how do you organize to actually create and share value from the technology? And this is the key to sustained adoption, and I would say this is the bit where we know least. Just reflect on this. The process that we did in oil palm and the process that we're adopting in grains growers too is actually a continuous cycle of engagement, analysis and discussion. It's not a one-off, there's not one simple answer, it's a continuous process. So us as scientists or advisors really have to prepare for a continuing engagement process in which we're learning as much, if not more, than growers themselves. We see this occurring at 3 different levels. At the local level, we expect to see growers, 2 or 3 growers within grower groups, actually experimenting, and they'll be prepared to share results locally. The act of doing the experiments and actually sharing results, we hope will build confidence, and sharing results actually generates knowledge at the same time, and also helps individual growers who might be experimenting in different things in different places share knowledge about diverse interests, because that's what farming actually is. But there's another level, at the state or regional level, where what we're hoping to do is actually develop a kind of consortium of experimenters within a number of different grower groups, and who we're hoping will share results. Maybe not original data, but will share results. And I think Leanne Wiseman, she's going to talk a bit about some issues of IP confidentiality. There are issues there which we can't ignore, I think, but there are ways of sharing results that maintain anonymity if that's required. The important thing about this is that we'll start to generate insights about regionally important factors, such as frost. You know, where did you get frost within the entire region? Within this particular year, why didn't you get particularly good response to potassium within certain varieties? For that, you need lots of experiments in a networked area. And obviously, as you start to generate more and more experiments and we start networking those, that's when you really start to generate big data analytics and start generating new insights that aren't easy to predict. At the international scale, and we're talking to people in several countries about this approach, and they like it, and there are some people just starting, they're some way behind us, but they're starting and they're very interested. We need that, because what we're looking about here is a different approach to agronomy. We actually want to get away from small plot experimentation. Not that that's not useful, but we think it's very difficult to move from the small plots or results from the small plots to big scale decisions. So we're actually taking a different approach. We want the experimentation to occur at the scale at which the decisions are being made. And that's new methodology, and basically isn't always welcome in traditional research circles. So part of the deal of the international network is to kind of push back on that and develop a methodology that will be understood internationally and support young scientists actually coming up who are prepared to engage in it and develop these pioneering approaches. Now, just a quick word about business models. The point is that if you don't have a business model for a certain change is extremely unlikely to occur. This is what we used to do this before. We used to have a lot of ideas that were basically good ideas, but didn't have a business model around them, so change could never occur. Fancy words, but they mean more or less common sense. The value proposition is basically, what are you expecting to change? What we're expecting is that somebody is going to do something differently and make more money as a result. That's important. Could be many different things, but we're looking at a general process. Now, that on its own is interesting, but that on its own won't generate any kind of change. There are other things that you need to consider. First of all are the stakeholders. So who's involved? It's not just individual growers, it's going to be growers networked in grower groups with other people around them. Important to consider who those people are going to be. There are going to be actions in the design, analysis, sharing of results, this kind of thing that are needed. Who's going to actually pay for those? So those got costs are involved in that. Not just organization or analysis, but there are other costs that are likely to be involved in that. So the bottom right is the key, is that where are the resources going to come from? Who's actually going to be prepared to pay for these activities? How can the value from this new information be demonstrated to be useful enough that people will actually pay for it? That's the key one, and that's where grower groups really are very important. Now, finally, just a couple of words about IP. Everybody's worried about this, and I remember this problem going back quite a long way, that farmers were very generous with us, at any rate, sharing their data. They're not always happy about that data getting into other people's hands for good reasons. And so IP is immediately an issue. Companies like John Deere have tried to sort of grab IP as part of their business model, and that has worked in some areas and tends to put people off in other areas. So intellectual property is an important thing. The first thing is that we've got to demonstrate value from the analysis, from on-farm experimentation to individuals. That's pretty easy to do, actually. You can easily show how if you put fertilizer out either at a different rate or in a different pattern or something like this, you would have made more money from this. And you can also show that if you want to do a follow-up, you can show how the fertilizer is actually making money for you. Okay, it's not too difficult to show how to generate value from the information from OFE, the on-farm experimentation. But the point is that the total value of the information will be much greater when those results and that insight is actually shared and people are able to use that insight collectively to actually manage better. That can be a problem, because we're talking about asking people to share their own data amongst one another and with third parties. We can control it, we can stop it spreading, and we can control it, but we're not the only ones facing this problem. And so I was interested last week to see this paper in Nature, that they're using blockchain technologies to actually make sure that the data remains in their control throughout the sharing process. So what I'm saying is that it's a problem, but it's not an insoluble one. And I hope Leanne talks a bit about this afternoon. It is an issue, but I think it's one that we have to work on. And I think really grower groups have a very important role in this process to actually step up and help manage the process and the flow of information from farmers and from their headers through the analysis to people who will help get value out of that data, but that it won't be actually shared with people that the originators of the data will not want. The other point about this is that for growers to keep contributing data or insight to this process, they've actually got to see some shared value back from that. So it's kind of, you show me yours and I'll show you mine kind of thing. Grower groups could be very, very critical in actually helping that sharing process and evaluating how useful the results are of other people's experiments to make sure that people are willing and prepared to contribute the process with their own data. So, summary, digital agriculture, fancy word, it is happening and it is a realistic thing and it is already here. There is an explosion of investment, as I said, over $10 million last year that we hadn't seen before, and that's really driving the thing. There is a substantial reorganization occurring within that side of things. Every month you probably see or probably get commercials or propaganda about things, organizations that didn't exist half a year ago. There are some organizations that seem to be doing great things a year or two ago that you don't hear anything about anymore. They've been bought up and just folded up. So there's a lot of reorganization around. Again, with grower groups, quite important and helpful to actually keep some intelligence on that environment, see how things are doing. The key to the digital agriculture change is actually making it profitable. Now, in many value chains, that's done by moving towards the market and looking for particular value from fancy grains, fancy vegetables, quality meat, all the rest of it. But there are still very major gains waiting to be had within grains, and some work done by CSIRO actually confirms that. The early expectations weren't realized I think. So, and that was because the expectations were unrealistic. And so what we're talking about here isn't just about the technology, it's about the management skill to use the technology, and that actually takes a lot longer time than just developing a bit of fancy software. And so the key to all this is actually organizing around the technology to ensure benefit. Critical thing here is actually showing how to generate and share value from the analysis, from the data. That's absolutely critical. As I mentioned, there are some tricky IP issues, but I think we're going to be able to get around those. And I would have said that potentially this is a major role for grower groups to help manage that process of putting out experiments, working out how to analyze the results, and working out how to share the data and how to create value out of it for both individuals, but also the grower groups collectively. So if anybody does want to play, or if you know anybody who does want to experiment, more than happy to talk to them. It'd be great to talk to them, in fact, and start developing this. We've actually got to a point now where we can actually move. So I throw my email and mobile number in there in case anybody wants to contact me. So with that, a big thanks for listening through here. Thank you.